Content warning. The Matherson Marriage contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and fictional domestic abuse. If you are in a real-life Matherson marriage, please reach out to the appropriate authorities for help. Resources you may find helpful include the Pixel Project's Domestic Violence Resource page and UN Women's International Helplines list. Resources will be linked in the video description for accessibility. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading from The Matherson Marriage by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 16. Pansy and Violet had just finished breakfast the following morning when Pansy heard her husband's voice in the hall. She started up, the blood rushing to her face. Basil! Here! When she had not expected him for another day. After a moment he came into the room. He looked at her sheepishly and away again. "I came on the early train," he said. "I've had breakfast." There was an uncomfortable silence. Did you walk up?" Pansy asked blankly. "No." He went to the table and fidgeted with some newspapers lying there. "As a matter of fact, Ramsden happened to be at the station and drove me as far as the gate. I walked up the drive. He wouldn't come in." "Oh, wouldn't come in!" Violet exclaimed. How horrid of him, when he knew that Pansy was home. She looked at her brother-in-law suspiciously. "Did you ask him?" she demanded. "Of course I asked him." There was a shade of irritation in Matherson's voice. He was beginning to feel ashamed of himself. He had even tried in a feeble sort of way to apologize to Ramsden without putting himself entirely in the wrong. He had said something about right being right and everything fair in love and war, but the contempt in Ramsden's eyes had silenced him. "If you present my check today, it will be met," he said before he drove away. No other word had been spoken between them, and they had parted without a handshake. "Damn it all! Anyone would think he was the aggrieved party," Matherson told himself, but he could not meet his wife's eyes. He made some excuse and escaped from the room as soon as possible. The two girls looked at each other. "Something's the matter," Violet said positively. Pansy shrugged her shoulders. "Oh, I don't think so. He does erratic things like this. I'm glad he didn't have to walk from the station, though. He would have been furious." Since last night, she had been almost happy. She believed in Lynn. She loved him and trusted him, and for the moment he had made her forget the utter hopelessness hedging them on all sides. She loved him and trusted him, and for the moment he had made her forget the utter hopelessness hedging them in on all sides. She wondered that he had not come up to the house with her husband, but she thought no doubt he would come later. But that day passed, and the next came and went, but there was no Lynn. Violet grew restless. "The country can be so dull," she said once to Pansy. "I'm not sure that London isn't the best place after all." When the third day came and went, she grew boldly defiant. "Have you quarreled with Lynn?" she demanded of Matherson. "He's never been near us since you came home." Matherson glanced quickly at his wife. "I'm not like women who spend their time quarreling with their friends," he answered rudely. "I'll bet they have quarreled all the same," Violet said uneasily, when she and Pansy were alone. "There's something the matter. Lynn would have been over here before, if things were all right. Why, he's never troubled to come and see you at all since you came back." Pansy forced a laugh. "Do you expect him to run about after me?" she asked. "Well, not exactly, of course," Violet admitted, "but it would have been polite, wouldn't it? We're all old friends, and I must say I thought he liked coming here," she added forlornly. But, though Pansy said very little, there was a vague fear in her heart. Could anything be the matter? If not, why had he stayed away? She was beginning to realize that the consciousness of his love was not enough, that she wanted to be with him, to see him, to hear his voice. Then she recalled his last words to her. "I shall never leave you, unless you tell me it is your wish that I should go." And she felt comforted. "I dare say he'll come over unexpectedly," she said to Violet. "Probably tonight." But Lynn did not come, and with the darkness Pansy's fears grew. Something was the matter. In her heart she knew it, and, unable to sleep, she got up and wrote to him. "I try to tell myself that there's no reason for your having stayed away so long, but in my heart I feel that there is. I want to see you, Lynn. Where are you? And why don't you come? If it's just that you feel you cannot come to the house, I will go to Hazel Lane tomorrow night after dinner. I know I should not say it, but I must see you. I love you. Pansy." She sent the letter by one of the servants early in the morning, and for the rest of the day she felt almost happy. Matherson was in one of his most cantankerous moods, but she bore with him patiently. The day might be long and tiresome, but it would end at last, and for a little while she would find happiness. When she put Buster to bed at night, he asked suddenly, "Dodie, where's Lynn and Tom Tinker?" She felt the color mounting to her face. "I don't know, darling. Do you want them?" He nodded. Tom Tinker most," he added truthfully. Pansy laughed. "I expect you'll see them tomorrow," she said. Buster looked at her with solemn eyes. "Joy says tomorrow doesn't never come," he answered. She thought of his words afterwards, though at the time they passed her by. She looked at the clock as she went downstairs. 7:30. Only another 2 hours, and then for a little while she would know the meaning of true happiness. There was a long, old-fashioned mirror hanging on the wall halfway down the stairs, and Pansy stopped and looked at her reflection. Such flushed cheeks, such bright, defiant eyes. "I'm a wicked woman, but I can't help it. I can't," she told herself in desperation. "Where's Violet?" Matherson asked crossly as they went in to dinner. "'Pon my soul, there's no punctuality in this house. If you're not late, she is. Visitors here seem to treat the place as an hotel." "You're late too sometimes," Pansy answered. "I'm the master of the house and privileged," was his retort. "But when it comes to your sister, here she is." Violet burst into the room unceremoniously. She had not changed her frock, and she still wore her hat and coat. "I've been over to see Lynn." She was breathless and flushed, and Pansy guessed that the tears were not far off. "And what do you think? But I suppose you knew," she challenged Matherson scornfully. "His put Chiswell's up for sale, and he's going abroad again." There was a dead silence. Pansy neither moved nor looked up, but her heart seemed to stop beating before it rushed on tumultuously. Matherson tossed off his wine. "Did you know?" Violet challenged him angrily. "I'm sure you did, only you wouldn't tell us. You're like a couple of oysters, you and Lynn. I tried all I knew, but I couldn't get a thing out of him except that he'd been unfortunate and lost most of his money." "I should sit down and have some dinner, and not get so excited," Matherson said curtly. "And as for Ramsden, yes, I knew, of course." His eyes fell. "I dare say I knew before anyone else, but it wasn't my business to tell you, and, as a matter of fact, he asked me not to. He's lost money, chiefly through his own fault, I consider, but that's neither here nor there. He's got to sell Chiswell's to meet his liability." "Oh, poor Lynn!" There were tears in Violet's eyes, and in her voice, too. She looked appealingly at Pansy, but Pansy neither looked up nor spoke, and Violet turned to the door. "I don't want any dinner, thanks," she said brokenly, and was gone. "Nice manners, I must say," Matherson said cynically. "You might give her a hint, if she doesn't know, that it's not polite to bang out of someone else's dining room like that." Pansy's lips quivered. "She's upset," she said with an effort, and then, "I think you might have told us, Basil." His eyes accused her furiously. "Why should I? I don't know you. Why should I? I didn't know you were also interested in Ramsden. It's his own fault this has happened, if you want to know. My own opinion is that it serves him right." She raised her steady eyes. "I thought he was your friend," Matherson blustered. "You thought wrong, then. We were only business acquaintances. I don't make friendships in a hurry. I don't trust people sufficiently. Ramsden chose to make a fool of himself, and he'll have to stand by the consequences." Pansy controlled herself with an effort. "Was it speculation?" she asked. Matherson laughed. "Some might call it that," he answered nastily, "but I know another word, an uglier one, robbery." She clasped her hands in the lap of her frock. "Of course! That's absurd," she said. "I'm sure Mr. Ramsden never did a dishonorable action in his life." Matherson's face flamed. There were times when he almost hated Pansy for her self-control. During the past 3 days he had deliberately spoken of Ramsden, watching her face, hoping to see some sign of emotion, but never once had she betrayed herself, and at the back of his mind he was beginning to believe that Ramsden had spoken the truth when he declared the fault to be his own. And at the back of his mind he was beginning to believe that Ramsden had spoken the truth when he declared the fault to be his alone. He would have given a great deal to have been able to tell Pansy that he knew what had happened, and see her cower, but he was afraid of Ramsden and of his threat, and so he contented himself with an evasive answer. "It all depends what you mean by a dishonorable action." Pansy rose from the table. "It's not worth discussing, anyway," she said. Matherson looked after her with suspicious eyes. "Where are you going?" "To see if I can't persuade Violet to have some dinner. She walked out of the room, and he called after her, "That's right, you spoil your sister as you do Buster." But she pretended not to hear. She went upstairs to Violet's room. The door was locked, as she had known it to be, but she was admitted after a moment to find Violet busily bathing her face. "Do have some dinner, Vi?" Pansy pleaded. "Don't want any. It's too hot to eat, and I should only be rude to Basil if I had to sit in the room with him tonight." She turned, revealing her tear-stained face. "He knew about Lynn. He knew all along," she said stormily. "And there's something behind it, too. I know there is." Pansy walked over to the window. "What did Lynn say?" she asked after a moment. "He hardly said anything. That was just it. He was nice, of course, and yet somehow he seemed like a stranger. I felt quite afraid of him, Pansy. I'm sure I wouldn't have dared to take hold of his arm to save my life, and we were such friends." How can he have changed so soon?" "I don't know. I wish I did. I asked thousands of questions, but he seemed to avoid answering them. I asked him to come over tomorrow. I said that the stupid money would make no difference to any of us, and he laughed. 'It makes a difference to me, though,' he said. And then I asked when he was going away, and he said as soon as he could settle things up, and that he would be so busy till then that he was afraid he wouldn't have much time for his friends. So then I said, in a sort of sarcastic voice, 'I suppose you'll find a minute to come and say goodbye to us.' And he took it quite seriously and said, 'Oh, yes, I'll manage that.' It was all just as if we were strangers." Her voice broke ignominiously. There was a painful silence. "Where did you meet him?" Pansy asked. "I didn't meet him. I went to Chiswell's and rang the bell, and that Mrs. What's-her-name, his housekeeper, didn't want to let me in, Pansy. Have you ever heard such a thing? But I just walked by her into the hall, and Lynn was coming downstairs." "Yes," Violet went on in a choked voice. "I thought it would be all right then, but it wasn't. I had the kind of feeling at once that he wished I would go, that he wished I hadn't come." Pansy said nothing. It hurt unspeakably, and yet in her heart was the knowledge that soon, very soon now, she would be with him, and he would tell her everything and explain. "I think life's beastly," Violet said, gulping down a sob. Pansy turned round. "I do wish you'd have some dinner," she said again, helplessly. "I don't want any. I'm going to bed." She kissed Pansy ashamedly. "I know you think I'm a fool," she apologized, "but, well, it's all so rotten." And Pansy heard her lock the door again as she went downstairs. It was getting dusk then, and it was past 9. Matherson was asleep in an armchair in the library, and Pansy took her coat and tiptoed across the hall into the garden. She walked slowly till she was quite out of sight of the house, and then she broke into a run. It had never seemed so far across the garden as it did tonight, and every nerve in her body was throbbing with passionate eagerness. But there was no Lynn at the Hazel Lane gate, and Pansy stood still with a shock of disappointment. But she quickly recovered herself. Something had detained him, of course. He would come as soon as he could. She opened the gate and walked down the lane, her white frock gleaming palely through the darkness. Every moment she expected to hear his step and see his tall figure coming towards her, but there was no sign of him. When she reached the gate that led to the woods, she stopped again, counting the seconds by her racing heartbeats. She shut her eyes and tried to think that when she opened them once more, he would be with her. But the seconds changed to minutes, and presently she heard the church clock strike the half-hour. She walked on, and to the end of the lane that led into the main road. It stretched away before her silent and deserted, and the terrifying thought leapt to her mind. Supposing he never comes again? She did her best to stifle the fear. He had promised never to leave her unless she wished it, and he was not a man to break his word. Something had detained him. Perhaps he had never got her letter. She walked slowly back to the Hazel Lane gate. She felt deadly tired and cold to the heart. He would not come tonight, now, she was sure. When she heard the church clock strike 10, she crept back across the garden and into the house. Matherson still slept in the library, and she stood for a moment in the doorway looking down at him. His face was red, and his mouth half open. He looked rather gross, she thought, and a little shiver went through her as she tiptoed away, so as not to waken him. She sat by her bedroom window till past midnight, looking out into the garden. Lynn might come, even if it was late. A dozen times she imagined she heard his step on the path below, but the night wore on hopelessly. "I shall have a letter from him tomorrow," she told herself, "or else he will come himself." But there was no letter, and no Lynn. Pansy could settle to nothing. Her heart seemed always beating up in her throat, choking her. She avoided Violet and dreaded her husband's eyes. It was at luncheon that he said, "I'm going over to Chiswell's this afternoon, and may not be back to dinner." Pansy caught her breath. "To Chiswell's? May I come, too?" She tried her hardest to speak naturally, but it was a failure, and she knew it. Matherson's eyes grew ugly. "You come? I thought you were always so anxious to avoid my company." Pansy flushed. "It is you who never seem anxious to have me with you," she answered. "I should like to come." She was desperate. She felt that she could not live through another night without seeing Lynn. "Well, then you can't come," Matherson answered shortly. "I'm going on business. Besides, I thought you didn't like Ramsden." She made no answer. She realized how hopeless it was. Possibly, had she not made the suggestion herself, Matherson might have insisted upon her accompanying him. He looked at her with jealous eyes. Had he been wrong after all? And did she care for Ramsden? His uncertainty made him cruel. When lunch was over, he followed her from the room. "You can come to Chiswell's if you like," he said. "I dare say you can amuse yourself while we are talking business." Pansy's heart leapt, but she controlled herself sufficiently to answer that she would just as soon stay at home. I'd rather you came with me, then," was his reply. The brutal side of his nature desired to see how Ramsden would take the unexpected meeting and what would happen. "I'll be ready in half an hour," he added. "Very well." But she felt ill with nervous excitement as they drove away. How could she bear to meet Lynn beneath her husband's critical gaze? When they reached Chiswell, she said breathlessly, "Let me wait in the car. I'm quite comfortable. I've read a book." "Oh, all right." Matherson drove up to the door and stopped. "I'll see if he's in," he said. "I thought you had an appointment with him," Pansy answered. He went into the house without answering, and a servant showed him into the library. Lynn was there, sitting at the table, bending over some papers. He looked up, then rose to his feet. "So you've come," he said in a hard voice. "Naturally, as you asked me. Sit down." But Matherson hesitated. He glanced uncomfortably towards the window. "My wife's outside in the car," he said at last. Lynn flushed crimson. "You brought her here." Matherson shrugged his shoulders, but his eyes fell. "She insisted." Ramsden took a check from a drawer. "Here's the balance of the money. That's all I wish to see you about. And to repeat again that if I find you've broken your word to me, I'll keep my threat. You understand." Matherson fidgeted uncomfortably. He hated his position, and he hated Lynn Ramsden for having forced him into it. He would not have minded the disgrace in the least, could he have remained master of the situation. The sense of defeat hurt his pride. Although he had done his best to ruin Ramsden, and had practically succeeded, he still tried to keep up an assumption of friendliness. "Well, no need to part on bad terms," he said. "I don't wish you any harm, as long as you keep out of my way. You've been a fool, but that's the worst I think of you." Ramsden's eyes blazed. "Is it? It's not the worst I think of you," he said with cold contempt, "and I shall be glad if you'll leave my house." Matherson folded the check and pocketed it. "Well, as far as I'm concerned, the matter's closed," he said jauntily. "You're going, and that's all that troubles me. Will you shake hands?" Ramsden strode past him and flung the door wide. "I'll see you dead and damned first," he said. And that is the end of Chapter 16 of The Matherson Marriage by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope that you have a great day. Bye!